We say, Mishanichnas Adar, Marbin Basimcha, right? When we begin Adar, we increase our joy. So this is an especially joyous month. Now, the source of that line that we all know, Mishanichnas Adar, Marbin Basimcha, the source of that line is actually kind of interesting, a little bit different than you might think. So it starts with the Mishnah in Tanit, in the 4th chapter. There it says, Mishanichnas Av mema'atin besimcha. When the month of Av begins, we decrease our joy. And the reason for that, of course, is that Av is the month of Tisha B'Av, right? It's a sad, sad time. And so the Mishnah tells us that when the month of Av arrives, we start to tone down our happiness. But the Mishnah only talks about sad Av. It does not talk about happy Adar. Okay, we have to wait for that until the Gemara. That's where our line comes from. The Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit, actually commenting on that same Mishnah that we quoted before, says as follows. It says, first it quotes the Mishnah, Mishanichnas Av mema'atin besimcha, and then it says, Amar of Yehuda Bereder of Shmuel bar Shilat, Mishmei derav. Okay, and here's the line. Keshem mishanichnas av mematin besimcha. Just as when it comes to the arrival of Av, that we lessen our simcha, kach, so too, mishanichnas adar marbin besimcha. So it's actually like a little bit of it's an interesting formulation, right? Keshem, just as when Av arrives, we decrease our joy. Kach, so too, when Adar begins, we increase our joy. It seems that there's some kind of connection between our obligation to decrease our joy in the month of Av and our obligation to increase our joy in the month of Adar. But what is the linkage between the two? What's this just as, so too, that the Gemara is getting at? So perhaps the meaning is this. When the month of Av arrives, the Mishnah tells us that we force ourselves to be less joyous, right? We actively make ourselves less joyous. Why? Because Tisha B'Av is coming, and we need to push ourselves to get into the mood for Tisha B'Av, into a sad mood. However good we might be feeling prior to the month of Av starting, we tone it down, right? When Av arrives, we force ourselves to be less joyous. So too when Adar arrives. Whatever our actual mood may be, as we enter the month, we actively force ourselves to be joyous. Just as we push ourselves to be less joyous in Av, so too we push ourselves to be more joyous in Adar, meaning that the Gemara isn't just describing the month of Adar. It's not just saying that Adar is like a fun month. It's not just saying 'tis the season to be jolly, right? It's saying just as, so too. That seems to imply that just as we have an obligation in Av, we have kind of the opposite obligation in the month of Adar, even if that takes effort, even if we have to manufacture that emotion a bit. Okay, just as we force ourselves to be somber in Av, so too we force ourselves, if need be, to be joyous in Adar. So with that background, the question of the night will be why? What's this about? Why do we need to be told to push ourselves to be joyous in Adar? The Mishnah's line about the month of Av makes way more sense because let's be honest, Tisha B'Av is a tragedy or commemorates a series of tragedies that happened a long time ago. And in real life, not everyone naturally feels the deep sadness of Tisha B'Av all on their own without some amount of work. The Mishnah realizes this, so the Mishnah tells us, Mishanichnas Av mema'atin besimcha. When Av arrives, start acting differently. Get yourself into a more solemn and serious mood. Gear up to be sad, says the Mishnah. And that sadness is important. It's actually good for you. So make it happen. Similarly, says the Gemara, with respect to Adar. When Adar comes, we force ourselves to be joyous. Why? Sure, Purim is a joyous holiday, right? It's a fun holiday. That's exciting, something to get up for. But why force ourselves, if need be, to be joyous, starting weeks before the holiday of Purim? Why gear ourselves up in this way? Why push ourselves to manufacture joy if necessary? So I think the answer to this question will give us some insight into what Purim is about. Okay, so that's kind of the setup. Hold that thought. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk for a moment about the story of the Megillah, or an aspect of the story of the Megillah. One of the strangest parts of the story of Megillat Esther comes in the 5th chapter, when Esther puts her life on the line and enters the king's chamber uninvited, right, risking death. And she does all this for what? So that she can invite the king and Haman to a banquet where presumably she's going to take down Haman. And the king says yes to Esther's invitation, and he bids Haman to come. And it feels like we're heading to some big climactic event. And we're told that the three of them, Esther and the king and Haman, they get to the banquet, and the king asks Esther, "What's your wish? And it shall be granted to you. What's your request? Even up to half the kingdom, and it shall be fulfilled." And here's what happens next. It says, "V'ta'an Esther v'tomer she'elati uvakashati." So, and Esther responds and says, my request and my ask. Then the next pasuk says, "Imatzati chen be'inei hamelech v'im al hamelech tov latet et she'elati v'lasot et bakashati." She kind of repeats again, like if it's favorable in the king's eyes, then grant my request. Yavo hamelech ve'haman el hamishtet asher e'aseh lahem umachar e'aseh kidvar hamelech. Right? Let your majesty and Haman come to the feast, which I'll prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do your majesty's bidding. Okay, this is super unusual. The big reveal at this banquet is that Esther asks the king and Haman to come back again tomorrow for another banquet. Super unusual. What's going on here? Okay, this is a very classic question. Very classic question about the Megillah. Why did Esther ask for a second banquet at that point rather than just confronting Haman right there and then? Many answers have been offered to this classic question. The simplest answer, I think, the pshat would be that Esther got cold feet. Esther set the whole thing up to call out and confront Haman, as she's going to wind up doing 2 chapters later in chapter 7, but she hesitated. And actually, the psukim hint at this a little bit, because after Ahasuerus asks Esther what she wants, the 7th pasuk, pasuk Zayin, reads, as I kind of hinted to before, "Vatan Esther vatomar she'elati uvakashati." And Esther answered, and she said, "My ask and my request." And the pasuk just ends. It's like an ellipsis, like a dot, dot, dot. My ask and my request is, end of pasuk. Perhaps the cutoff pasuk implies something like her voice gave out, she hesitated, she pauses, and then she struggles again to regain her composure. She says in the following pasuk, "If it please your majesty, please come back tomorrow." End of scene. You can imagine Esther going back home that night, shaking her head, maybe a little disappointed with herself, just as Haman leaves the banquet elated with how things have gone for him. Now, we, having read this book before, know what's coming, that in the next day or so, a lot of action is going to take place, right? A mysterious set of events unfolds that sets things in a better direction, right? That's the night that the king can't sleep, which sets up the reading of the book of the State Chronicles, which reminds us of the story of Mordecai saving the king's life, which sets up the reward parade for Mordecai and sets up Haman's embarrassing downfall. And only then, after all that has happened, Esther feels empowered at the second banquet to go ahead and go after Haman. So the simple reading is that at the first banquet, Esther lost faith in herself, you might say, something that she will not do when she gets a second chance at the second banquet after all these things have happened in the meantime. Okay, now, as I'm saying this, some people listening to that description and what I'm calling the shot might object and say, wait a second, this is Esther that you're talking about. You can't say that about Esther. Give her some credit. There's no way that someone like Esther would lose her self-confidence or lose her nerve. That's not a very, very nice way to describe what's happening here. But keep in mind that in a number of places in Tanakh, we see that Tanakh has no qualms about showing us stories where even our greatest heroes sometimes lose faith in themselves, at least momentarily. And just to give a few examples of this, the most obvious one is Moshe, right? Moshe begins his career by saying, who am I that I should go to Paro? How can I possibly get Bnei Israel out of Egypt? So he kind of starts out with this, you might say, humility. And ultimately, Moshe steps up and becomes our greatest leader, right? The kind of the leader that he's meant to be. But later in his career, in the desert, right, in the book of Bamidbar, Moshe deals with all of the complaints of Am Yisrael, and his confidence seems to lapse. And he says lines like, Lo uchal anochi levadi laset et kol ha'am hazeh. I can't carry these people. They're too much. They're too heavy. It's too much of a burden for me. Ve'im kacha at oseh li, and if you, oh God, are going to kind of force this upon me, hargeni naharog et matzati chem ve'enecha. Please just kill me if I have found faith in your eyes, ve'aler eberati, and not see any more of my wretchedness. Okay, so this is Moshe like kind of throwing up his hands at certain moments, and saying, I just can't do this anymore. This is too much. Better to kill me now. Okay, in the end, Moshe, of course, will recover, and he'll lead the people all the way to the border of the promised land. But at certain times along the way, when times are tough, we see that even Moshe lost his faith in his own ability to pull the whole thing off. Okay, one example. Another example, Eliyahu Hanavi, in the book of Melachim Aleph, right, First Kings. After Eliyahu wins his amazing duel, you could call it, right, his amazing challenge against the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, Har Carmel, Eliyahu believes at that point that he's just scored a big knockout blow for God against idolatry. He thinks he's won. But that's not how things actually go. The next thing that happens is that the Queen Yezebel, kind of the major benefactor of Baal worship in Israel, okay, she doesn't give up so easily. And even after Eliyahu's great victory over the followers of Baal at Mount Carmel, the queen sends her minions after Eliyahu to kill him. At which point, Eliyahu becomes despondent because this is a huge letdown for him. Eliyahu thought that he had won once and for all against all those who supported Baal. And now here he was, a fugitive, running away from the same queen who had killed so many other prophets of Hashem, we are told, prophets like him. At that point, we're told that Eliyahu laid down under a bush and prayed that he might die. And he cried out, enough. Now, Hashem, take my life, because I am no better than those who came before me. So at that moment, Eliyahu temporarily lost faith in himself, though he will, of course, also kind of pick back up. But that is a moment where he kind of loses faith. Here's another amazing example, just on a very similar theme. Yaakov Avinu, in Parshat Vayishlach, the Torah tells us that Yaakov heard that Esav and his army are approaching, and Yaakov springs into action. He splits his camp. He sends gifts to try to butter up his brother. He cries out to Hashem. He does all these things. And then we're told that Yaakov sent off his family ahead and crossed a ford in the river, Ma'avar Yavok. And there, Yaakov found himself alone. That's the place where Yaakov will wrestle with perhaps an angel, some kind of mysterious being. Who will give Yaakov his new name and who will injure Yaakov's hip, right? We know that story. As you read that story, the obvious question is, what was Yaakov doing alone on the other side of the river, away from his family? Rashi famously explains that Yaakov had forgotten some small jars on the other side of the ford in the river, and he'd gone back to get them. But anyways, that's one explanation. Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, gives a very different and amazing explanation, maybe simpler, right? Rashbam is kind of known as the Pashtan, right? Giving the simple reading of the text. Here's what Rashbam says. Very interesting. He says, commenting on the line, Vivater Yaakov levado, and Yaakov was alone. So this is Rashbam's language. He says, Klomar, she'havir kol asher lo, shelo haya od la'avor, elahu levado, v'ratza la'avor acharehem. Basically, it says that Yaakov set it up so that he was the only one left who had not yet crossed, right? Everybody else had crossed, and the only one at the very end that would cross last was him. Why? Kedei livroach, derech acheret shelo yifgeshenu Esav yitkaven. Because it was his intention to run away in a different direction in order not to have to meet Esav. And then he says on the next comment, v'yavek, about the angel kind of wrestling with him. He says, this is Rashbam's explanation, Malach imo shelo yuchal livroach. The angel wrestled with him so he could not run away. So according to Rashbam, Yaakov Avinu lost his cool, you could say. He was ready to run away from Esav, even leaving his whole family. And the whole point of the angel grappling with him was to say, Yaakov, you cannot run. If you want to live up to your birthright, you have to stay and wrestle. So an amazing reading. Okay, so anyways, a number of examples. What we see over and over again is that it seems that in Tanakh, it's okay to say that sometimes even our greatest heroes lose faith in themselves, at least momentarily. It seems that that is what happened to Esther before she manages to right the ship with a bit of help and encouragement from above in the Megillah. So what did that whole detour have to do with this? Okay, we did two things. We talked about being joyous in Adar, and we talked about how sometimes even the best of us can lose faith when times are especially tough. Okay, so Purim is, as we know, our most joyous holiday, perhaps, right? A very joyous holiday, let's say. It's super fun. But honestly, when you think about it, the story of Purim doesn't on its own make you jump for joy, because we just have to remind ourselves of how the story of the Megillah goes, big picture, right? The story of the Megillah is that a genocidal maniac is almost successful in his attempt to annihilate the Jews of Persia. And while we manage to survive and win a great victory, the whole story is basically a near-death experience, right? A near-death experience. So Purim celebrates a victory that they failed to kill us, but the whole situation is terrifying. And so celebrating on Purim is kind of like saying the bracha of Hagoma, right? The blessing, the bracha that we say after we've survived serious danger. We're thrilled with how things have turned out. We are thankful relative to how things could have gone. And so it's important that we show our thanks, but it's an unusual kind of happiness. It's thank you that this horrible thing that almost happened to me didn't fully happen in the end. And I want to stress this point because sometimes we lose sight of it. Okay, so often we lump the holidays of Purim and Hanukkah into the same bucket, which makes some sense because they're both rabbinic holidays, right? They're both set up by the rabbis. And they both celebrate military victories, and we say Al HaNisim on both of them, and they both have to do with the few overcoming the many. So there are many similarities between these two holidays, but Purim and Hanukkah are actually quite different. And here's the easiest way to see that. At the end of each story, what has changed? At the end of Hanukkah, the Hashmonaim managed to carve out a Jewish kingdom that lasts for like 100 years. At the end of the Hanukkah story, we achieve sovereignty in the land of Israel for the first time since the days of the first temple, after hundreds of years of being subjects from the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks. Right? Hanukkah is a total game changer. That story is a total game changer, not just a victory of the few over the many, it is that, but also the creation of an enduring Jewish victory, right? That allows us to live in a totally different way for generations. The before and the after are really, really different. At the end of Purim, on the other hand, what exactly has changed? Yes, our enemies have failed. They did not kill us. Yes, the Jews of Persia got the upper hand. And yes, Mordechai and Esther are in a power position and can defend the Jews of the Persian Empire, at least in their lifetimes. Okay, but bigger picture, not that much has really changed in an enduring way. The Jews who are saved are still living in exile. They're still a distinct and unloved minority people living under foreign rule, basically always at risk that the next Haman might show up. And this question is actually comes up in the Gemara itself, and kind of the Gemara's typical, roundabout way of getting at the issue. But basically, the Gemara reflects on this difference between the holidays of Hanukkah and Purim in the following way. Right? The Gemara points out that Purim and Hanukkah are quite different. In the course of a discussion about a halachic issue, why do we not say Hallel on Purim? Okay, we typically say Hallel on other holidays, right? Certainly on the Shalosh Regalim, also on Hanukkah. Okay, so the Gemara wonders or asks, why don't we say Hallel on Purim? And the Gemara gives three possible answers to this question, why we don't say Hallel on Purim. But the most hard-hitting one of the three is the following. Rava says that there's a line in Hallel where we say, Hallelu Avdei Hashem. Praise, O servants of Hashem. And Rava says, how can we say this line of praise in Hallel, right? Praise, O servants of Hashem on Purim, when, and this is Rava's language, he says, Akati Avdei Achashverosh Anan. He says, how can we say that line of praise that we are the servants of God when, quote, we are still the servants of Achashverosh? So what exactly does Rava mean? It's a little bit of a mysterious line. Are we today the servants of Achashverosh, the king from the Megillah story? Like, what exactly does that mean? So in a simple sense, you might say that at the end of the Megillah, the Jews were still the subjects of Achashverosh, that they were, sure, they had survived the worst of it and Haman failed, but they were still at risk from any crazy tyrant of the Persian Empire or any other Haman that would come up. They were still the servants of Achashverosh. And you might say that on an even deeper level, perhaps what Rava was saying is this. Rava himself lived in Bavel, as so many of the rabbis of the Talmud did, right? Of the Talmud Bavli. They lived in Babylonia, where they themselves were subjects of the Persian Empire. Many, many years after the Purim story. So Rava and Amora, right? One of the rabbis of the Gemara. Rava lived about, let's say, 800 or so years after the setting of the story of the Megillah. Yet he too, all those hundreds of years, many hundreds of years later, was himself living under Persian rule, as he was living in the Sasanian Persian Empire. Now, okay, you might say that's a later dynasty, it's not Achashverosh's line, okay. But the bottom line is that the rabbis of the Gemara were hundreds and hundreds of years later, living still as Persian subjects. And maybe that's what Rava means when he says, Akati Avdei Achashverosh Anan. We are still servants of Achashverosh. 800 or so years later, here we are still living as a distinct minority in exile, still under these damn Persians. Okay, so that's maybe what Rava is getting at. So when you think about it, Purim is the celebration of a near-death experience. It's like a Seudat Hoda'ah, right? A Thanksgiving meal that you have to celebrate after you're delivered from a near tragedy. It is a celebration, but it's not a celebration that you ever really want to have to celebrate. Just like Hagomel is a blessing that we say, which basically what all these things do is, Hagomel is a blessing that we say to turn a trauma into a blessing. And a Seudat Hoda'ah is a festive meal where we turn a trauma into a celebration. And Purim, similarly, is a holiday where we take a trauma and we turn it into a celebration. In all of these cases, we do it for the same reason, which is to help us move forward and derive strength from a struggle that we've had. We basically spin a traumatic experience into a cause for celebration so that we can grow from the experience instead of being paralyzed by it. And once we recognize this is kind of a core aspect of the Purim story and Purim celebration, then it helps better to explain that first line that we started with, that Purim is a holiday of what you might say is, manufactured joy if necessary. That's how we started. When Adar comes, we have to actively cultivate joy. We have to force ourselves to be joyous, whether we are joyous or not, even if we still have plenty to be concerned about, even if we are still slaves of Achashverosh, even if we could just as easily be hobbled by trauma that we've been through, right? And all the dangers that are still in front of us. Despite all that, we celebrate Purim with this tremendous joy because that is the Jewish way to transform trauma into strength. And I think that's the connection to all those stories that we went through from Tanakh, which basically said that it's perfectly fine to be afraid and to sometimes lose your cool or lose your confidence. Even our greatest heroes had lapses of confidence, as we saw with Esther, as we saw with Moshe and Eliyahu and Yaakov. Okay, all of those stories from Tanakh told us in this kind of surprising way, over and over, it's natural to lose your confidence sometimes when times are really, really tough and when the deck seems stacked against you. In those times, it's easy to have a defeatist mindset. It's easy to get down. Okay, it's easy to enter a doom loop of negative thoughts. And the answer to that is Purim, right? The answer to that is Hagomel. The answer to that is Seudat Hodah. A response to near tragedy is Purim, to take our trauma and rather than turning that into PTSD and despair, we turn the story into a celebration and a source of strength. Okay, so that maybe is Misha Nichnas Adar Barbin Besimcha. When Adar comes, we force ourselves into a positive mindset, even if Akati Avdei Achashverosh Anan, even if we're still in a tough spot, so to speak, servants of Achashverosh, still in an uncertain and dangerous world. And Adar, rather than dwelling with what's wrong, because there's always plenty wrong, we push ourselves to focus on what's gone right. And that's how we close out the Jewish year. That's basically the last month of the Jewish calendar. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of recap what we've seen tonight because we covered a bit of ground. So we started with the Gemara in Tanit, which had this interesting setup that we don't always quote. The just as part of Misha Nichnas Adar. Just as we force ourselves to be less joyous in the month of Av, so too we force ourselves to be extra joyous in the month of Adar. Misha Nichnas Adar Marbin Besimcha. And we asked, what's all this forcing? Why force yourself to be joyous? Because Adar is a month of Purim, and Purim is, when you think about it, a story of a near-death experience. It's a Seudat Hodah, a celebration of the worst that didn't happen. And Purim, as we discussed, models how you can turn trauma into strength, because Purim is all about deliverance from something that could have happened, and we celebrate it with a full heart. Okay, we push ourselves to be joyous, and we accomplish that in a very particular way, which is we find that joy and we find that ability to move forward by celebrating with others. All the mitzvot of Purim push us together. We read the Megillah in public. We have a Seudah with our friends and family. We deliver Mishloach Manot. And we give Matanot Evyonim. We give and we share. We come together. That's what all those mitzvot are. They're different than like shaking a lulav or something, right? They're a different thing. They're all kind of communal, familial. The antidote to despair, it seems, is fellowship and community. And I should say, for those who enjoy a few drinks on Purim, it's possible that that also is a little bit on the theme of manufactured joy, manufactured simcha, if need be, right? Drinking ad lo yada until your worries are washed away, at least for a day. So maybe on the same theme. So perhaps the message of Purim is that sometimes we have to look at all the dangers that we face and all the traumas that we've been through and say, despite it all, our response is to be joyous, even if we have to push ourselves. Okay? Even in years when, like maybe this year and certainly last, it would be reasonable to be more somber or muted or worried. Adar Marbin Besimcha. We move forward from our national traumas by focusing on the miracles of how we've overcome, and that can be a source of strength for us. So hopefully a few things to think about this year's Purim.